Welcome back to the Synapse sessions. Today we're honored to host Dr. Brian MacWhinney, a professor of psychology at Carnegie Mellon. Dr. MacWhinney is a pioneering developmental psychologist whose research has fundamentally transformed our understanding of how humans acquire, process, and lose language across the lifespan. Beyond his theoretical contributions, Dr. MacWhinney has also had an extraordinary impact on the field through his creation of CHILDES and TalkBank, the world's foremost repositories on language data. These accessible corpora have democratized language research as well. From examining how toddlers effortlessly master grammar to understanding how the brain reorganizes after stroke, Dr. MacWhinney's work bridges cognitive science, neuroscience, and computational modeling to reveal the fundamental mechanisms underlying one of humanity's most remarkable abilities. Dr. MacWhinney, thank you for joining us for the Synapse sessions.
Thank you for the lovely intro. And I agree. Yeah, language is a remarkable ability.
So my first question to you is what drew you to study the brain?
Well, the brain, I must say, I began really studying child language, and I realized, we back in the 80s, we were doing these rather primitive connectionist models and things, and I don't think we took the brain very seriously. Even my colleague Herb Simon, a Nobel Prize winner, he said, we don't know anything about the brain. We shouldn't spend our time doing that. So, and of course, then suddenly, neuroscience started to make all these advances, and this was well before AI, right?
Uh-huh.
We were already with fMRI, I think, and I started to realize that, we had these models that were pretty good about how language is learned and studying, the structure of language, but we had no idea how that was really done in the brain. My colleague Jay McClelland, who's now at Stanford, was getting more and more into the brain, particularly about the hippocampus and memory and so on. So I started to realize, you really have to, if you want to really have a theory that really explains things, you have to have at least some link to processes that go on in the brain. I
Mhm.
think that's particularly true for second language learning. So I got into a lot of thinking about how first language learning is different from or similar to second language learning. We believe in critical periods that there's a time when you can't learn second languages, but in fact you can. It may be not as fluent. So
Mhm.
how does fluency work? How do we develop fluency? And that really takes you back to the brain with the basal ganglia and the anterior cingulate and so on, and the consolidation of processes. So you can't really understand things until you start at least thinking about the brain.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So I I know that you've had an incredible journey from how humans learn to produce and learn speech, first and second language acquisition, all the way through the impact of aging-related diseases like stroke and dementia. Just as a starter, I wanted to hear what that journey was like, how you made the transition, and if there are any observations or interesting comparisons that you think could be made or should be made between those two periods of language learning.
Well, no, I certainly, between first and second language learning, that is to me the idea of a critical period, which was put forward by Eric Lenneberg back in the 60s, really, um, there is obviously, we have a harder time learning as we get older. I'm 80 now, and picking up a well, I can get better at languages I already know. So I found that to be true, but picking up a brand new language is getting harder. But that's, I'm way past the critical period of 13, which it was what Eric Lenneberg said. So to me, those two ideas, it's the same brain, you're learning the same language. And in fact, there's a lot of evidence that the age-related thing is often because we have too much email when we get older. We have too many committee meetings. But when we go off into aphasia, traumatic brain injury, stuttering, these things become much more physiological. It's not just a matter of too much email. And I think the reason I got dragged into that was that all the methods that we had developed for studying child language and second language were also very good for studying these other phenomena. So I started to realize that, that you could use the same techniques to
Hmm.
study every aspect of language, really. And that, in a way, it was very naive, I think, of me, because these are things are very, very different. When a person has a stroke, this is a big deal. You're losing a big part of your brain, or when you have Alzheimer's and you're starting to decay. But it is still impacting language, and you still have language data. So I got it more and more into just the raw means of collecting the data and making questions, almost methodology.
Hmm.
Uh, uh, and I think that's fun, and it's really important to people. I mean, right now there are, I'd say, 1,000 laboratories around the world that are looking at our data on dementia, because dementia is such a big challenge, around the world. Uh, but in terms of the actual language processing, we don't really know yet how it's working.
Hmm.
But it's a great biomarker or a great indicator of the onset of dementia. So the tools are really important. And now AI, we can now start to apply AI to language data. And that makes it really interesting. I mean, if you could just take all the data in TalkBank and then throw it at AI and use AI to tell you, who are the people who are having most problems with stuttering and everything. It's a whole new world now, really.
Yeah. It's really crazy how much these two fields are now combining with
That's true.
neurolinguistics and AI. So maybe I'll jump to that. A huge part of your impact on this field of neurolinguistics has been your creation of these repositories. So I wanted to really ask, what was your initial goal with Childs and later TalkBank? What was the problem you were trying to solve at the time? Because obviously it's become such an important facet of the field. What was really that core motivator for
No,
creating?
it's really a good question. I think you really have to go back to child language. And I think one of the core motivations there was that in the 70s and into the 80s, all of the research on child language was based on these sentences made up by linguists. And then and a little bit of data. I mean, Roger Brown, 1973, started to collect data from three children, and I started at that time, to I mean, we didn't even have good tape recorders, and we had no internet. We worked on IBM PCs and Commodore computers, these little these little toy computers. So the technology got better and better, and we could make transcripts, and that gave rise to an area called usage-based linguistics, which was, really an antidote to this sort of theoretical linguistics that really wasn't based on data. It wasn't, if it was made up by linguists, and it's interesting. Theoretical linguistics is really an interesting area, but it isn't what we're really doing when we use language.
Mhm.
We're really using usage based. So by having these recordings, we could see how children were really picking up language bit by bit out of things that ways that they were interacting with their parents. And to some degree, we have that in second language, but we really did a great job in child language of getting all that data. And so I think that we then started to see, well, that's the same thing in aphasia. We want to see how people are recovering, but it is a big jump. I mean, admittedly. But it's the idea that data should drive the theory. You should really know what people are doing rather than, Now, I should say experiments are good too, So I did millions of experiments in my life, and not millions, but certainly hundreds. And they just are not the actual nature, they're not the actual usage in the real world. So you need both. I think you have to put together experiments. I mean, even in aphasia, we do, word naming tests, we do, sentence repetition. These are not real functional language, but then we use real functional language, narrative descriptions, and so on. So trying to put together all these different sources of data to understand, where are the barriers that a certain aphasic has. Aphasia is, depends on where the stroke is in your brain. You're going to have very, very different, results.
Mhm.
So really, there's so much to learn from using all those methods, really,
Yeah.
using both experiments and also getting real functional data. And the other thing is, I think one of the biggest problems we have, and this was not a problem in child language. We had, like, for example, I studied my children for 6 years. I recorded them from, birth to six. By six, they're already off and, in their own world. Yeah. But we don't have enough longitudinal data on aphasics, on people with Alzheimer's. We really need to follow them to see how they recover. Unfortunately, in Alzheimer's, you don't recover, but you do want to see how things progress. And people do recover from stuttering.
Hmm.
Children recover, and some kids don't, and why? So these are really important questions.
Yeah.
I must say that the clinical stuff, really, of course, is important for people's lives. And the child language, it's interesting, but everybody's going to learn pretty much. Yeah.
And I think you touched on it, but one of the most important research works that you worked on was the competition model, how we develop these first languages and even eventually second languages. I really wanted to touch on the question I had is since you've developed it, how has the model changed and evolved in the
Oh, great
light
question,
of
Srikar.
new
Thank you.
science?
Yeah. My favorite question, actually. Yeah. Well, so our core work, that was all experimental. That was back, as I say, before we really had the data that we could share and so on. Um, but we've had a real core finding in our work on the competition model, which was based on what we call Q validity, which was really the accuracy, the reliability of a Q. And we compared different languages like Italian and Hungarian, Japanese, Chinese, all these different languages. They have very different cues for, understanding a sentence and who did what to whom, or when was it done and what a co-reference are. So all these linguistic things are, hugely different really from one language to the other. And what people rely on are the strongest cues. Now, how do you know whether Q is strong? It's whether it is the most reliable. And so
Mhm.
you actually then go back to data, to corpora, and look at which cue. And in English, for example, the biggest cue on knowing who did what to whom is what is the noun before the verb.
Mhm.
It's not the first noun, it's the noun that sits before the verb. That is the actor. And it's an incredibly powerful cue in English, but not in other languages. Hungarian doesn't care about that. Tagalog doesn't even do that. So that we learned really a lot, and then we also learned about other things about how it went on in real time and everything. So that was a great model, and really I'd say all the findings from that model actually all held up. It was really nice to have a model that really works. But it wasn't the brain.
Yeah.
It wasn't the brain. And it also didn't deal with fluency very well.
Mhm.
It because we just, we had these subjects going boom, boom, boom and doing an experiment. We didn't follow them getting better and we didn't have the in order to study fluency, you have to actually record people talking, telling stories, see where their pauses are, their retraced false starts, and so on. So fluency is a big, big dimension of all these things, of child language, aphasia, dementia. Fluency is such a big component of all of these things. So we had to get into fluency. And then I also, to really solve the critical period thing, I had to look more and more at life history. You
Mhm.
know, why is it that when little children, go to preschool, everybody accepts them and they're fun, for immigrant children have no trouble in preschool, but later on their peer groups form and people are ostracized and bullying, sort of all that stuff,
Yeah.
and making it much harder for older children to integrate with, the second language. So we got eventually I started to realize that we really needed a broader model. So and we had already been dealing with the idea of emergence with all the connectionist models. But I learned more and more about emergentist theory and started to really work on the idea that really, I don't know if I explain it all here during our 30 minutes, but um, language on the one hand has all the competition. That's the competition of the competition model. But it also has emergent levels. So there's the level of phonology. There's a level of articulatory and
Wow.
auditory phonology. Even in audition, there's three levels of processing, just the acoustic signal, the syllable, and then the word. So all of these levels emerge during learning and probably in certain areas of the brain, and they emerge over time. That's the other thing. So when we talk about the development of even conversational strategies or things like humor or understanding metaphor, it takes a while for a child to get into that. So all of these sort of emergent structural levels occur through a series of time. So right now, I'm basically working on the idea of competition, uh, levels of representation, and time scales.
Got it.
And if you put those all together, then everything makes sense. But within all those, so I also use a lot of metaphors or analogies coming from biology. So,
Mhm.
for example, protein folding is a great example where you see protein. You don't know what a protein is going to look like when you just look at the chain of amino acids.
Yeah.
But if you look at the levels of the structural formation of the protein, you see that there are a bunch of constraints that come in. First making a bunch of sheaves and helices, and then making, we call it the level one, two, three, and four.
Yeah.
And it's really very similar that we have constraints in language that force us to go into a new level of understanding morphology or syntax or discourse. And so constraints are a really important part of emergentist theory. And then what I realize is that constraints are basically mechanisms. So in protein folding, it's hydrogen bonding or other types of mechanical processes. In language, it's things like um, spreading activation, hippocampal reentry, cortical consolidation. So there are these brain mechanisms and learning mechanisms that really are the constraints that come together and essentially determine the structure and the use of language. So it's great. We have all these theories, but we haven't put them together. So
Hmm.
that's the fun thing, is to put them together.
And I have a little bit of a silly question now. Do you think that AI is going to be what unifies those features?
Yeah, well, of course, I want to say I really do like the emergentist question, and that to me that's the most fun. But the second biggest one is the one you just asked now. Is AI going to solve our problems? Are we actually, I think a lot of it is the other way around. That as we learn more about the brain, we can take those ideas and apply them to generating new forms of AI. The current ones are great. I mean, they do, they plan your weekend for you or whatever,
Yeah.
or translate languages, but they don't really interact as humans yet. They have to be retrained for every they're not general. They have to be fine-tuned for everything, and they make crazy mistakes and so on, So there's obviously a lot more that has to be done. But also they consume an enormous amount of energy. They lead to global warming. That's not a good thing, right?
Yeah.
So our brain doesn't use it uses millivolts of energy.
Yeah.
And so why are they why are they using megawatts? It's because they're not using the same algorithms.
Mhm.
And so the more we can use brain-like algorithms and brain-like training for I think the better it can become and the more general it can become, more human-like it can become. And of course, we don't want to be exactly like humans because we also have limitations, and then just using, also people in psychology now are using AI models, large language models, to align them with neural responses from humans to see what degree the AI is almost a model of the brain functioning. Well, it works a little bit now. I think as you get more and more, your AI becomes more and more neuromorphic, you might call it, then you're going to get more and more nice ability to use the AI to model the brain.
Yeah, definitely.
There's so many options and so many possibilities. I mean, it's Oh, we have a lot of troubles in our world, but some of the science is just fantastic now. I think we've entered an incredible age in obviously cosmology, but also in this whole area of AI and the brain.
Yeah. So I wanted to ask you, what questions keep you like restless in this field? After doing it for so long, what's your driving force?
Emergentism, really.
Version.
And I think trying to really link up the behavioral data with really what's going on in the brain, but really putting all these things together. That's my driving force is that you see a little information from one area, from neurolinguistics or cognitive psychology or AI or database, and that makes sense, but they're all talking to each other.
Mhm.
And how do we, if you have a framework where all these different sources of information can talk to each other, then actually you start to get a picture of what's going on, which
Mhm.
is fun. I mean, I love the James Webb Telescope telling us about the beginnings of the world. I think we can learn the same about how the brain is really, the brain and language are doing things. And it's not just about, it's also about how language changes over time. What are the forces that drive us? And you get into social structure a lot. A lot of the changes that occur, and even, in second language learning, but a lot of the changes that occur are ones that are reflecting, social movements. Like, vocal fry. I don't know if you know about vocal fry, but
Yeah.
that's a great one.
Mhm.
Yeah. So I think putting things together is really fun. It's actually probably that's what we all want to do in science is put things
Yeah.
together. But I like to put them together through emergentism.
And my last question to you is, what advice would you give to students interested in the brain, in neuroscience, in neurolinguistics, in just exploring science as a whole?
Yeah, that advice to students is a tough one because sometimes it's you want to look at ideas that are already well understood and fit in with a movement, and sometimes it's nice to start off on your own about a new question. But I found, and this is maybe a little bit off from what most people's advice would be, is I think that one should always be prepared to move to a slightly different question because sometimes you find that you can't solve one of your first questions or you've gotten far enough or maybe people are ignoring you. That's another one that happens. You can find out the right answer and everyone ignores it. And then at that point you say, okay, I'll wait till they figure it out, and move on to a new question. So I think it's very important in thinking to be fairly flexible and see uh, the value of what you've done, but in a related area. And so you can see that bridge. Now, not a bridge too far, but a bridge where you move slightly into one area from one area to another. And I think that really enriches yourself, and it also is very practically good because sometimes the actual rewards of where you get funding, who you can work with, are going to be a little different. So be flexible and but still rely on your own abilities and what you've achieved so far. That would be, I guess, my advice. Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. McWhinney. This has been an incredible interview.
Oh, it's
I
fun. Yeah.
truly appreciate your time. Thank you so much for joining us for the Synapse session.
Okay. Be good. Thank you. Okay.